Today, we're going to be talking about Victoria, which is in the southeastern part of Australia. I looked that up. And so, we're going to focus on Utricularias. That's something I really have been looking forward to because, as most of you guys know, I have a background in aquatic plants, aquarium plants, and Utricularias are quite often used in aquascaping. And so it's a name that I've been familiar with for a long time. I'll be honest with you, for 8 years, I didn't even know it was a carnivorous plant. So when I discovered that, it was like extra cool bonus points. So at any rate, today we have Boaz from Australia. I don't know quite what city you're in, but just to give you guys a heads up of how I found him, and the website is, like I mentioned, I like aquarium plants, and one of the things that I like to do with aquatic plants is doing nature aquascapes. And so I've got this appreciation for trying to emulate nature. I guess part of that flows into my bonsai too, nature in miniature. So when I was looking up photos of blank in the wild, this website, Fierce Flora, kept popping up. And there were these amazing high quality photos and very detailed write-ups and information about expeditions. And obviously whoever was writing it was very well informed and intelligent. And so the back of my mind, I just had this very deep admiration for whoever was behind it. And then when we started Skippy and we started looking for speakers, I thought, hey, I started reaching out to a bunch of people, and Boaz actually responded right away. He was super responsive and super eager to help us out. And so I've been looking forward to hearing from him. And this is my first time actually speaking and seeing him. So thank you very much for being here. At this point, I'm going to stop my screen share. And Boaz, if you want to share yours, we can go through your presentation.
Yeah, cool thing. Thanks for the introduction, John. Let's see if we can get this working. Cool. Is that full screen for everybody?
Looks good.
Cool. So as John mentioned, my name is Boaz. I'm currently based in Melbourne, in Victoria, and that's in the southeast of Victoria. I'm a medical researcher. I study immunology, which is quite a hot topic at the moment, but you probably know me from my posts about carnivorous plants. So as John mentioned, I have a website and a blog called Fierce Flora, where I post a lot of my photography of carnivorous plants, and I especially focus on shooting these plants in the wild. So I'm known a bit for my expeditions. I've been to places like Sumatra, or Western Australia last year, but due to obvious reasons, I've only really been able to travel locally within the past year or so. So today I'm going to give a presentation about my expeditions during the last 3 months of 2020, with a special focus on the Utricularia within my state of Victoria. So let's get started. So in November, at the end of the 3-month lockdown, Australia finally defeated COVID, and I was actually allowed to travel interstate. Well, not interstate, within my state. And just to contextualize the size of Victoria to the international audience, it's roughly the size of the United Kingdom, or a bit over half the size of California. So it's quite a big piece of land. I started out my expedition in the western part of the state, in the Wimmera region, and then heading towards the Grampians mountain range. After that, I went back to Melbourne to work for a few weeks. And during the Christmas and New Year's break, I went to the eastern portion of the state, to central Gippsland, East Gippsland, and then up through the high country in the northeast. So today I'll be talking about my travels in these areas, and especially I want to focus on a complex of plants called the Utricularia dichotomy complex. So recently in 2013 and a master paper last year in 2020 described a lot of new taxa within this complex. And I really had to go and see these plants for myself in wild and study their ecology and take pictures of them so everybody can see them. So our journey begins in the plains of the Wimmera in Western Victoria, where after 3 long years of drought, the rains had finally returned. Now, inland southern Australia is quite wet and cold during the winter, and the majority of rainfall occurs during these colder months. And it's also during this period that the wetlands are filled and the Utricularia are actively growing. And in the springtime, when the weather starts to warm up, the water level in these wetlands slowly recedes into summertime. And of course, like the reason I was here in the Wimmera was to find one of the most beautiful and elusive species of bladderwort in Australia. And going there, I was a bit nervous because I had been told by other people that this site has been like completely dry for 3 years. But as I arrived, I was relieved to find that the entire area was very lush and green, with a lot of plants, a lot of insects, and it was just alive. And on the margins of one of the lakes, I saw splashes of purple, and I knew that I was at the right place at the right time to see this beautiful plant. This is Utricularia bugleholii. And I'll just foreshadow this talk by saying that the purple-colored Utricularia they have a very convoluted history, and we'll delve into some of that today. And the identification of these species can be based on very subtle features. So these features to look out for in Utricularia bugleholii is the lower corolla lip. That's the lower petal. And in this species, it's very wide and it's very flaring. So it forms an angle of like up to 180 degrees. That's the wide arch. And the upper corolla lip, that's the upper petal up here. It strongly reflects upwards, so it points straight up. And you'll notice that there's very dark purple veins. And the other feature of the flower that we're going to reference today is the palate, and that's the region in the middle of the plant. So the palate in Utricularia bugleholii is very distinctive. It features numerous yellow ridges, which aren't very prominent, and they're quite evenly spaced. So interestingly, I also found different color variations in these flowers. So aside from the usual purple, the usual range and intensities of purples, I found an albino plant, which pure white, no purple at all, and also a mauve colored variation, so a very light purple without any dark purple pigment, it seems. And the species grows in shallow swamps and ditches, which are filled during wintertime. And as the weather starts to warm up during summer and water starts to recede, the plants begin to bloom as their leaves are exposed to the air. And I'm sure you're aware that Australian weather can be quite unpredictable. So the blooming period can actually be very short in some sites, especially the roadside ditches, which don't hold a lot of water. But in the bigger wetlands and where water accumulates more, like literally thousands of these plants can be found blooming at the same time. And just to show you what I mean, I've got a video clip. I'm not really sure how well it can display, but yeah, you'll see that this entire wetland was filled to the brim with Utricularia bugleholii. And it was just so amazing seeing this beautiful site, this massive wetland, filled millions, probably millions of these plants really. And yeah, so I felt very fortunate to find this very elusive species in the wild. At the edge of some of the wetlands, I also found another species. This one's Utricularia barkeri. And it was only really discovered, well, it was discovered ages ago, but it was only really formally described in 2013. And previously, it was circumscribed under Utricularia dichotoma. This is a bit surprising, seeing that it's probably like the most commonly encountered bladderwort in central and eastern Victoria. The feature to look out for to identify this plant is the upper corolla lip. It's got flecks and speckles of purple in it. It's a very distinguishing feature. If you look at the palate region, it's also quite constricted, and it's flanked by 2 tall purple ridges, and it sort of always reminds me of like shrugging shoulders. And the lower corolla lip is it's flared generally downwards and outwards. So this species tends to grow in lowland seepages and shallow water. So for example, this site here in this image was at the side of a walking trail where water was seeping out of the surrounding bushland. I also found it in some of the swamps in the area, and particularly at the edges where, again, the water flows in from the bushland. I think one of the most striking sights I saw was that So it was this site, and this was at the base of a mountain called Mount Langi. And on this mountain, there's large rock platforms that channel rainwater and accumulate water at its base. So at the base of these large platforms, we get these very wet, mossy seepages. And this obviously was a good habitat because there were thousands of Utricularia barkeri just forming a very dense population of plants. So having explored the plains of the Wimmera region, I then turned towards the mountains of the area. And I went to the Grampians Range, which is a dramatic sandstone mountain range with sheer cliffs that rise abruptly from the plains below it. And I think the area is one of the most scenic in Victoria, and I really love to go camping and hiking there. But of course, the reason why I was there at that time was to find a bladderwort that was endemic to the region, and this one's called Utricularia grampiana. Well, I'm sure you're beginning to notice that all these plants practically look the same, which is probably why the species wasn't formally described again until 2013. And just like Utricularia barkeri, the upper corolla lip is speckled. The lower lip, the lower petal is quite flared. But the distinguishing feature to look for is the yellow ridges of the palate. And the yellow ridges here, they hook forward and strongly overhang the lower petal. So by itself, the flowers are pretty small and it's somewhat unremarkable, but really what it lacks in size it makes up for with numbers. And the species grows in such impressive densities that they can color entire rock faces purple. And this is probably because it grows in such a hostile niche. So there isn't much competition from other plants. So it's able to really dominate its niche. Utricularia grampiana is restricted to the upper slopes of the Grampians, where it can be found on a thin layer of moss that grows on top of exposed sandstone rock platforms. The nature of the species is an annual species, and it grows during the wet winter months. And as the weather warms up in spring, it starts blooming. And by summertime, this few centimeters of moss is completely dry, so the plants die, unfortunately. And just as stunning as the plants is the scenery where it grows. Now, the plants are only found in exposed areas above 400 meters elevation. And at this level, in the morning, it's always foggy and there's a lot of rain during the winter. So these seepages are kept moist well into the summertime. And because it grows in such an exposed niche, you're always guaranteed an amazing view. So for example, I found this beautiful population on the upper slopes of a mountain called Mount Difficult, which is quite appropriate, I think. The red stems here are Drosera auriculata, the green ones are Drosera gunniana, and you'll notice that there's tiny little purple dots of Utricularia grampiana, but I just thought it was a very beautiful sight, very dramatic scenery, which is why it's one of my favorite species to go out and find. And if you're less inclined to climb a cliff, you can also find them at the side of walking trails. So I'll just show you a little video of the plant and how they appear in the wild. If you're in the right place, you just find thousands of the plants along the walking trails, and it's really quite a beautiful sight to behold. So also in the Grampians region, I found a species called Utricularia tenella. And like its close relative Utricularia multifida from Western Australia, the species has a 3-lobed lower corolla lip, and the shape of the plant always reminds you of a spacecraft somehow. And the species is absolutely tiny, so unless you're on your knees, you're not really going to see it. It's very easy to overlook. They grow on seepages at the edge of bushland. So there's quite a common species throughout the southern states, especially in Victoria. And well, after this, I already had found all the species I wanted to find in the west part of the state. So I headed back to Melbourne to work for a few weeks. And this took me to the Christmas, New Year's holiday period, where having done the west of the state, I decided to head out east to see what I could find. I started off in the central Gippsland region, which is immediately east of Melbourne. And the area is geographically, it's fairly flat. It's near the coast and has a very nice sandy substrate with a lot of heathland. And again, I mainly focus my exploration around the swamps to look for various carnivorous plants. And yeah, so this is during the middle of December. And in the deeper pools, I found a species called Utricularia australis, which is a floating species that forms whorls of leaves. And in the nodes of these whorls, the species grows little bladders. And because it's suspended in the water column, it's well adapted to capture some of the largest swimming microinvertebrates like copepods or mosquito larvae. So it's a good species to have in your ponds to get rid of mosquitoes. But overall, the species is pretty common. I've seen it many times. So I wasn't too excited, but the reason I was there was to find a new species that was only resurrected from synonymy with Utricularia dichotoma last year. And there's only like 3 sets of images of this species online. So it's probably one you haven't seen before. And I'm glad to introduce today this one, which is called Utricularia opposita Flora. It was originally described in 1868, but in 1989, Peter Taylor, in his iconic monograph about Utricularia, circumscribed it under Utricularia dichotoma. So in that monograph, pretty much all the purple-colored bladderworts in southern Australia were all reduced to synonymy with Utricularia dichotoma. But last year, a paper came out from Richard Jobson up in Sydney, and he systematically analyzed the genetics of all the purple Utricularia. And yeah, so after looking at the genetics at the molecular level, this species was revealed to not actually be closely related with Utricularia dichotoma at all. So it was revived as a species in its own right. And the most distinguishing feature to look for is the upper corolla lip. So that's this top petal again, and it features very dark, prominent veins, which are absent in Utricularia dichotoma. The palate region is quite narrow and it's a bit tubular, and the skirt is hangs downwards and it isn't very widely flaring. Another distinguishing feature is to look at the spur. Now, the spur is the little hook bit at the bottom of the flower. And the spur of Utricularia opposita Flora it's quite broad. It's flattened from back to front. And yeah, and in terms of length, it's also shorter than the lower corolla lip. And the leaves are also fairly distinctive in that they're very long and strappy, especially in contrast with Utricularia dichotoma, which has shorter, more oval-shaped leaves. The species is known from coastal heathland in shallow seasonal swamps and creeklines, and actually grows in a lot. It's actually very widespread. So most people do confuse it with Utricularia dichotoma, but as we learn more about this plant, we're learning more about its ecology and how common it really is. So I found it in a shallow wetland system where it was blooming where the water had receded and it was starting to dry out. So having found the plant, I continued east along the coast to East Gippsland, which is at the border between my state of Victoria and New South Wales. Now, it seems so long ago, but you might remember that just over a year ago, Australia was gripped in horrific bushfires, and most of this area had been burnt to the ground pretty much. The remarkable thing about the Australian ecology is that it's remarkably adapted to bushfire. And this is probably most apparent in the swamps. So you'll notice that there's a lot of burnt trees, and this would have been just completely choked out by leptospermum bushes. And these ferns at the bottom would be like 1 or 2 meters deep. So when fire doesn't exist, light is unable to penetrate to the ground. But when fire rips through the land, it clears its undergrowth and allows the sunlight to hit the soil. And the ash from the fire provides nutrients for a new generation of plants to grow. And it's really only after fire that these coastal swamps become accessible to people like me who want to search for carnivorous plants and other species in these coastal wetlands. So immediately upon entering the swamps, I found a ton of Drosera binata, the forked sundew, which is a species that absolutely loves fire, and it responds with massive growth and mass blooming events when these swamps are cleared by fire. I also noticed tiny blooms of Utricularia lateriflora. So this is a terrestrial species that's pretty common in heathland, and I've seen it many times before, so wasn't too excited about it and didn't spend too much time photographing it. But I really got excited when I noticed that there were splashes of purple in the bushland, and I realized that they were Utricularia dichotoma. So after all this time of finding random plants that weren't Utricularia dichotoma, I finally found the real species. But I say that, but of course, there's nothing simple about Utricularia dichotoma, especially given that it's a species complex of like 8 individual subspecies, as revealed by genetic analysis last year. So I think this one is Utricularia dichotoma, subspecies maritima, which is the subspecific epithet refers to its coastal environment. And the way to identify the species and subspecies is by looking at the bracts. The bracts are these little leaf-like structures where the flower scape attaches to the inflorescence. And I'll just zoom in a little bit. So the bracts of Utricularia dichotoma are all fixed to the stem at the base, and those of Utricularia dichotoma, subspecies maritima, have a rounded base at the bottom where the bract attaches to the stem. So yeah, it's the species and the subspecies, based on very subtle features, and I'm still learning about it every day. Every time I see these plants in wild, I'm still learning more, which is, I think that's quite beautiful. And like Drosera binata, Utricularia dichotoma responds very well to bushfire, and the best displays of the plant are often seen in regenerating bushland. And this is because in normal years, as I mentioned before, the thick layer of bushes and the ferns, which grow like a meter deep, they literally crowd to the ground, and sunlight is unable to reach the bottom of the soil. So the plants lie in a dormant state. But after fire, this thick undergrowth is completely burnt off, which gives the plants that grow in the soil a chance to proliferate and bloom and make a new generation. I also found a bunch of the blooms in a shallow creek system, and I had a really lovely time, like just tracing the creek line and finding hundreds of these sundews and bladderworts, growing along its and the entire creek. And yeah, it was just a very beautiful place. Now, originally my plan was to continue along the coast and head back up to Sydney, where was my hometown, and I was going to spend some time with like friends and family over the holidays. But perhaps in the most like 2020 kind of events, a COVID cluster suddenly emerged in Sydney, which meant that the state border was going to be closed, and I had to like scramble back into Victoria to avoid being trapped out. So after a bit of sulking overnight, I decided to head up north through the mountains and explore the alpine bogs of the Victorian High Country in the northeast of the state. Now, this area rises over 1,500 meters in elevation, and which means the air is very crisp and very fresh, and the scenery is amazing, and it makes for perfect summer hiking. And it's also the best time to look for plants, since in wintertime the entire area is covered in a layer of snow. And it was up here in the Bogong, this area is called the Bogong High Plains. I knew that there was a rare species of Utricularia that I really wanted to study. And as I made my way to one of the sites, I noticed hundreds of Drosera arcturi, that's this alpine sundew, but curiously I couldn't see any bladderworts around me, and I thought I was too early in the season. But it wasn't until I really got down on my knees and looked around that I actually found that the bladderworts were all around me, and I just missed them because they were so tiny. So this tiny flower is it's called Utricularia menanthus, and it's a species that only grows in the alpine regions of Australia. Well, maybe I shouldn't say species, because like the genetic work from last year showed that this taxon is actually a subspecies of Utricularia dichotoma, so it's very closely related to the rest of the species complex. So more accurately, it should be referred to as Utricularia dichotoma subspecies Monanthos, very long name. And the plants are immediately identifiable by their very small size and very short stature. The flower stems only grow just long enough to elevate the bloom above the soil and above the waterline. And in most locations, the species grows alongside Drosera arcturi, but it's actually a lot more pickier than the sundew in terms of its habitat. The majority of the surface in these alpine bogs is actually an accumulated layer of sphagnum that grows at 1 to 2 meters deep. And since this bladderwort grows directly in the soil, it's unable to penetrate the sphagnum beds. So it's only really in very select locations where the PT subsoil is exposed that you can really find these bladderworts. So I searched around quite a bit, and the only place I could find them was around these seepage sites on sloped hills. And I suspect that this is because the angle and water flow from the hill prevents significant accumulations of sphagnum. And this allows the peat to be exposed to the surface, and therefore it allows for the Utricularia to grow in it. And just to indicate what the habitat's like, here's a video of one of the seepages. Now you'll see that these red beds here are all Drosera arcturi. And you know, it's just amazing seeing so many carnivorous plants in this beautiful habitat. And yeah, so I would have stayed a bit longer in the mountains, but there was an approaching rainstorm, which meant I had to quickly escape to the plains below. And I found myself in the northeast region of the state, at the foothills of the Great Dividing Range. So the area here is it's pretty hilly with a lot of exposed granite bedrock and well-drained soils, and you know, the hot summer weather means that most of the creeks in the area only flow during the cold winter time. So by the time I was here, the water level had receded significantly, and it was well on its way to being parched. But I knew that there was a chance for rare species of bladderwort to still be in bloom. And this was remarkably adapted for the Australian climate. You might have heard of it referred to as the tuberous form of Utricularia dichotoma, but in fact, genetic analysis shows that it's very closely related to Utricularia bugaholi. So the new name for this taxon is, it's a long name. It's Utricularia bugaholi subspecies orientalis, with orientalis referring to its eastern distribution. The interesting thing is that the taxon looks nothing like Utricularia bugaholi, subspecies bugaholi, in that you remember that the ones I showed earlier had a very wide lower corolla lip, and the ridges of the palate weren't as prominent, whereas in subspecies orientalis, the yellow ridges stick out quite a bit, and they're very crowded around the center of the palate, and it also has numerous very tall and angular ridges. So overall, the lower corolla lip of the plant is quite unique in that it's very bumpy and has very sharply delineated angles. The best identifying feature was to look at the corolla spur, which it's very long and it has a sharp point, and generally it occurs at an obtuse angle relative to the lower petal of the plant. And from what I saw, the species, it grows to the edge of these highly seasonal creeks and a mixture of sand and clay. And as the creeks dry out in summertime, they form these dormant tuberous structures that are resistant to desiccation. And when the autumn rains return, they sprout again, and they grow as perennial in that sense. In some way, I think it's quite remarkable and inspiring that they've adapted to grow in such a harsh environment. And as a newly described taxon, we actually don't know too much about its ecology and range, and in some places it actually looks exactly like Utricularia dichotoma. So, as a community, we're still learning a lot about these plants. And, this is one reason why I go on these expeditions to, really see the plants in the wild and understand the environment, how they grow, what they look like, and to share that knowledge with other people. Well, that brings me to the end of the 2020 expedition across Victoria. But in reality, I'm practically always out in the bush, every other week searching for carnivorous plants in the wild. And I feel most at home in the wild. Like just last weekend, I was up in the high country again, and Mount Buffalo, where I was studying Utricularia dichotoma subspecies, dichotoma. And yeah, I just love being in the wild looking for carnivorous plants. Um, so I just want to spend a moment talking about my project, Fierce Flora, which is my blogging website, which is entirely dedicated to carnivorous plants. I'm active on Facebook, and most of my content eventually makes it to the website, but it might take a while. What I do is I especially focus on contextualizing these plants in the natural habitats through a bit of photography, a bit of scientific discussion. And well, recently I've been thinking about my role in the bigger picture. So how can I contribute to broader challenges facing the environment and climate change and habitat degradation? And of course, like carnivorous plants and conservation go hand in hand. Many of the habitats we saw today are very fragile, like a few centimeters of moss on top of a 400-meter high cliff, or a very shallow swamp at the edge of a farm. And it only takes small changes in the climate or development or agriculture to completely destroy these sites. And I think carnivorous plants are just so fascinating. And so through Fierce Flora, one of my goals is to inspire my audience to take interest in these plants and to care about them, and by extension care about where they grow. Because at the end of the day, the only way to affect meaningful change in the world is by caring, I think. Well, that's the end of my presentation. If you're more interested in some of the papers I was talking about, I recommend these two by Jobson, which really delves into the genetics of the Utricularia dichotoma complex, which we saw a few taxa come out of today. Yeah, I think I'll hand it back to John.
Fantastic. Yeah, like I mentioned before, like that website, the fierceflora.com website is so beautifully put together. And for those of you that like to read, and not just look at pictures, his descriptions are amazing too. In the Facebook event description, I had linked a recent article that was published. I can't remember off the top of my head. Do you remember? I think it was Italian or French or
Yeah,
something.
so I
Where...
wrote a story for the Association of Italian Carnivorous Plant Enthusiasts. Yeah, that was about my trip to the Western Australia. They were kind enough to dedicate an entire journal article about that. Quite proud of that one. So
Yeah, that was really cool.
there's a link on my website to the my expedition to Western Australia if you're interested.
Yeah, so I'll dig that up and I'll put that in the chat for anybody that's worth or interested in checking that out.